Most people think strength is about holding on, but the real power is in being able to let go. The moment you stop needing approval, outcomes, or guarantees, you become someone the world can't control anymore. Detachment isn't weakness. It's the most dangerous form of freedom. And once you get it, nothing and no one can shake you again. Detachment isn't about abandoning your drive or lowering your standards. It's about stepping into a level of control that only comes when you stop letting the world dictate your internal state. It's the moment you shift from reacting to everything around you to responding with intention, clarity, and ownership. Most people think power comes from pushing harder, caring more, or obsessing over every detail, but that actually creates pressure that clouds judgment. Real power comes from the ability to pause, breathe, and look at a situation without emotional distortion wrapping itself around your logic. When you detach, you're no longer negotiating with fear, because fear only has power when you're anchored to outcomes you feel desperate to protect. You stop needing approval from people who don't even understand your goals, and you stop trying to control things that were never yours to control in the first place. This is where real clarity begins, when the noise fades and your thinking becomes sharp, precise, and undiluted. You start acting based on what aligns with your values, not what feeds your insecurities. You become a person who is guided by intention rather than compulsion. And intention, not intensity, is what creates long-term power. Most people lose their leverage because they are emotionally entangled with what they're trying to achieve. And that entanglement makes them operate from fear. They fear losing the opportunity, fear looking stupid, fear being judged, fear disappointing someone, fear that it all depends on this one shot. But when you detach, you strip the fear of its oxygen, because fear only grows when you're clinging to something as if letting go would destroy you. Detachment says, I want this, but I don't need it to feel worthy, capable, or confident. That shift takes you from desperation to discipline, from emotional reactivity to strategic thinking, from chaos to calm execution. You're no longer trying to control the outcome. You're focusing on controlling your skill, your preparation, your behavior, and the choices you can actually influence. This makes everything you do more effective, because your energy goes into the work itself instead of the drama surrounding it. You perform better because you're not tense, anxious, or over-attached to the result. You're present enough to see opportunities others miss, and you're strong enough to walk away from anything that compromises your standards. Detachment also makes you a more resilient person, because you stop breaking every time something doesn't go your way. You no longer interpret challenges as personal failures or signs that you're not enough. You understand that setbacks are data feedback and part of the process rather than evidence that you should quit. This level of neutrality stabilizes your emotions and protects your focus, which makes you significantly more dangerous in the best way. When you're not crushed by rejection or inflated by praise, you maintain a steady center that nothing can easily disrupt. People around you start noticing that you don't get rattled, and that creates authority, because predictability is a form of leadership. You become someone others trust because your decisions aren't impulsive or reactive. They're grounded and intentional. Even in chaos, you think clearly, because your self-worth isn't tied to controlling the situation. This calmness isn't weakness. It's the highest level of strength. It's the kind of strength that can't be shaken, manipulated, or derailed. Another layer of detachment is the freedom it gives you to stop living life on other people's terms. Most people are controlled by the opinions and expectations of others, even when they pretend they aren't. They shape their choices around being liked, accepted, validated, or admired, and they end up living a life that feels heavy and unnatural. But detachment cuts the strings and lets you operate independently of external approval. You no longer perform for the crowd. You perform for your purpose, your standards, your mission. This makes you bold enough to take risks others avoid, because you're not paralyzed by hypothetical judgment. It makes you confident enough to admit when you're wrong, because you're not anchored to the image of being flawless. It makes you focused enough to stay consistent, because you're no longer distracted by what everyone else is doing. When you detach from expectations, you create space for authenticity to lead your actions. And authenticity always produces more progress than pretending ever will. Ultimately, detachment reconnects you with your own power, because you stop outsourcing your emotional stability to circumstances you can't control. You stop letting a good day inflate you and a bad day break you. You stop letting people dictate your mood, your choices, or your direction. You become someone guided by values rather than noise, integrity rather than impulse, purpose rather than pressure. You make decisions from a place of strength, not worry, because you're no longer emotionally entangled with the outcome. You're playing the long game, where consistency matters more than temporary discomfort and identity matters more than instant gratification. You become intentional with your energy, selective with your responses, and strategic with your commitments. This is the superpower, not needing the world to behave a certain way for you to stay grounded. When you reach that point, nothing external can control you. And when nothing controls you, your power becomes limitless. You perform at your highest level when you stop gripping the outcome so tightly that it strangles your ability to think, adapt, and execute with clarity. The irony is that the more desperately someone wants a result, the more they tense up and sabotage the very performance needed to achieve it. Needing something introduces pressure, and pressure makes you narrow-minded, reactive, and emotionally charged instead of strategic. When you detach, you shift from "I must win" to "I choose to show up as the kind of person who wins," and that difference changes everything. You stop operating from fear of loss and begin operating from alignment with your identity and standards. You allow yourself to focus on the process instead of obsessing over the scoreboard. This creates mental spaciousness, space to think, to adjust, to stay aware of what's actually happening rather than what you're afraid might happen. Without that fear-driven tunnel vision, your performance becomes cleaner, calmer, and more precise. You stop forcing outcomes and start influencing them. This is where real mastery begins, because mastery requires presence, not panic. When you stop needing the outcome, you begin to understand what real confidence feels like, because confidence isn't a feeling. It's a relationship with your own effort. You trust yourself because you're no longer measuring your worth by whether you get a yes, a sale, a win, or applause. You trust yourself because you know you will execute regardless of how things turn out, and that reliability becomes your internal anchor. Most people try to build confidence by achieving things, but detachment flips that. You achieve more because you're no longer constantly questioning yourself. You stop asking, "What if I fail?" and start asking, "What would the best version of me do right now?" That shift removes the emotional noise that makes so many people freeze when it's time to perform. You no longer waste energy protecting yourself from disappointment because you're not tying your identity to the result. This frees up your mind to take risks, experiment, adjust quickly, and stay fluid in situations that would overwhelm someone who's too attached. Your actions become bolder, cleaner, and more decisive because you're moving from choice instead of fear. And decisive action compounds far faster than anxious effort ever will. Most people don't realize that attachment not only weakens performance, it also shortens endurance because desperation drains energy. It creates emotional spikes where you oscillate between "I need this to work" and "I'm terrified it might not," and both states reduce your long-term capacity. But detachment stabilizes you. It removes the dramatic highs and lows that make people burn out or quit too early. When you stop needing the outcome, you can stay consistent without exhausting your emotional fuel tank. You no longer chase the rush of immediate results or collapse when they don't appear quickly enough. Instead, you operate like someone who understands that long-term wins belong to the person who keeps showing up with discipline, not urgency. This makes you significantly more effective because effort without anxiety is sustainable, but effort fueled by fear is temporary. You begin to enjoy the work again because it's not a test, it's a choice you've committed to. You stay in the game longer, which alone gives you a massive advantage because most people quit the moment discomfort doesn't pay them instantly. Detachment gives you the stamina required to outlast, outwork, and outperform everyone who's still chasing quick validation. The power of detachment ultimately shows up in how you evaluate yourself, because performance becomes about alignment rather than achievement. Instead of obsessing about whether you won, you start asking whether you acted like the person you're trying to become. This creates higher standards because your focus shifts from external scoreboard metrics to internal integrity metrics. You can walk away from any situation proud because your measurement isn't "did this go perfectly?" but "did I show up fully aligned with my values, preparation, and intention?" That mindset makes improvement easier because you no longer take feedback personally. You take it as data. You become coachable, adaptable, and emotionally steady because your ego isn't tangled up in the outcome. Progress becomes inevitable because you're not fighting against your own emotions while trying to perform. You're simply refining the behavior, habits, and choices that build success over time. When you stop needing the outcome, you stop shrinking under pressure and start expanding into the version of yourself capable of winning consistently. And the people who win consistently are the ones who detach from results and obsess about identity, effort, and execution instead. When you detach your worth from the roles you play, the numbers you hit, or the praise you receive, you step into a form of emotional freedom that most people never experience. You stop living like your identity is a hostage to circumstances outside your control. You stop getting pulled into the emotional tornado that comes from chasing validation or fearing rejection. Instead, you become a steady, self-led person who doesn't crumble when someone disapproves or panic when something doesn't go as planned. This emotional steadiness gives you leverage because it makes your decisions cleaner and your boundaries stronger. People can't guilt you, pressure you, or manipulate you when you're not dependent on their approval. Situations can't break you because you no longer interpret setbacks as reflections of who you are. You relate to challenges differently, they become problems to solve instead of judgments on your value. You're finally able to see reality without the distortion of insecurity. And that level of emotional freedom changes how you move through every part of your life. When you're emotionally free, you start operating from intention rather than reaction, which immediately increases your leverage in any environment. You're not the person who gets triggered easily or spirals emotionally when something unexpected happens. Instead, you analyze the situation with clarity because you're not entangled in the need for it to look a certain way. You can negotiate better, communicate better, lead better, and create better because your emotional bandwidth isn't being drained by insecurity. Detachment gives you the strength to pause instead of explode, to listen instead of defend, to choose instead of react. And that calm, grounded behavior gives you an edge in environments where everyone else is emotionally chaotic. People who remain centered in chaos naturally rise to leadership roles because others trust them. Trust is built on consistency, and consistency is only possible when your emotions aren't constantly hijacking your actions. Emotional freedom becomes a competitive advantage. It turns you into the kind of person whose presence alone brings stability to the room. One of the greatest forms of leverage that detachment gives you is the ability to walk away when something is misaligned instead of staying out of fear. Most people stay in the wrong relationships, the wrong jobs, or the wrong environments because they're emotionally attached to the comfort, familiarity, or false sense of security those things provide. They're afraid that leaving will make them lose identity, validation, or certainty. But when you detach, you stop settling for situations that drain you because your sense of self doesn't depend on them. You can walk away confidently because you trust yourself to rebuild, recalibrate, or start fresh without losing who you are. This makes you incredibly hard to manipulate because no one can hold anything over your head. They can't threaten to withhold affection, opportunity, or approval because you're not dependent on those things to feel stable. You operate from self-trust instead of fear. You stay only where alignment exists. And that ability to walk away gives you leverage that people deeply attached to external validation will never have. Detachment also gives you leverage in how you deal with criticism and pressure because it turns both into useful data instead of emotional attacks. When your identity isn't tied to what others think, criticism becomes information you can evaluate calmly. You don't crumble because someone disagrees with you, and you don't inflate because someone praises you. You stay level. This allows you to take feedback objectively, apply what's useful, and discard what's irrelevant without emotional drama. Pressure also becomes easier to handle because you're not attaching catastrophic meaning to every moment. You understand that pressure is part of growth, not a threat to your identity. So you perform better under pressure because your nervous system isn't overwhelmed by stories about what failure would mean. You can think clearly, act efficiently, and stay composed in situations that would break someone who is overly attached. This steadiness multiplies your effectiveness. It makes you someone who can be trusted under high stakes. Another way detachment creates leverage is by freeing your mental space from constant comparison and competition with others. When you're attached to external validation, you're always measuring yourself against someone else's achievements, timelines, or perceived success. This comparison creates anxiety, envy, and self-doubt because you're basing your worth on metrics that have nothing to do with your path. But when you detach, you stop competing with people who aren't even playing the same game as you. You stop chasing standards that other people set. Your energy shifts inward toward mastery, growth, and consistency instead of outward toward approval or status. And this inward focus accelerates your progress because you're no longer distracted by trying to outshine others. You start measuring yourself by your own progress, not by someone else's highlight reel. That creates a level of self-respect and inner alignment that comparison can never give you. Emotional freedom also makes your relationships healthier because you stop connecting from a place of neediness or fear. You're no longer trying to earn love, maintain peace by sacrificing yourself, or shift to be accepted. You show up as your real self because you're not afraid of losing someone whose approval once defined your identity. This honesty creates stronger, more authentic relationships because they're built on truth rather than fear. You can set boundaries without guilt, express needs without apologizing, and walk away from disrespect without second-guessing your worth. People sense this strength, and it changes how they treat you. Those who try to control others usually lose interest when they realize you can't be controlled. Those who value respect and mutual growth become drawn to you because you bring stability and self-respect into the relationship. Detachment doesn't make you cold, it makes you clear. And clarity is what keeps relationships healthy, not emotional dependence. Ultimately, emotional freedom gives you leverage over your own life because it removes the invisible chains that keep people stuck. You stop living reactively, guided by fear, anxiety, or the need for external validation. You begin choosing your path intentionally because you're not emotionally entangled with outcomes or opinions you can't control. Every decision becomes cleaner because it's based on what aligns with your values, not what soothes your insecurities. You develop a calm inner authority that makes you more capable, more resilient, and more powerful. And when external circumstances no longer determine your internal state, you become someone who can weather storms that others collapse under. Your stability becomes your leverage. Your emotional neutrality becomes your advantage, and your detachment becomes the foundation for every form of growth, success, and personal power you build moving forward. Most people suffer not because life is hard, but because they spend their energy fighting what already is, trying to reshape reality through resistance instead of strategy. When you detach, you stop arguing with the truth and start engaging with it, which immediately saves you from emotional exhaustion. Accepting reality doesn't mean you like it, approve of it, or plan to keep it forever. It simply means you acknowledge what exists in front of you without distortion. This acceptance gives you the ability to respond with clarity instead of denial, frustration, or wishful thinking. You stop wasting time hoping the situation magically changes and instead focus on what you can change. It's the shift from, why is this happening, to, what am I going to do next? That single shift transforms passive suffering into active problem solving. It turns confusion into direction and turns emotional chaos into strategy. You reclaim your internal power because your energy is no longer tangled in resistance. Reality stops feeling like an enemy and becomes a map you can actually navigate. When you stop trying to control everything outside of you, you suddenly become far more effective with the things within your control. Most people drain themselves attempting to manipulate how others act, think, or respond, and they end up resentful because people rarely behave the way they wish. Detachment frees you from that endless cycle by reminding you that your influence ends where another person's choices begin. You can guide, you can lead, you can communicate, but you cannot control, and accepting that gives you back hours, energy, and peace. You begin directing your focus toward what you can improve, your discipline, your habits, your skill, your attitude. This creates momentum because your effort is finally being used in areas that guarantee growth rather than areas that depend on someone else's cooperation. Detachment also gives you emotional protection because you're no longer devastated when people disappoint you. You simply recalibrate. You stop personalizing the behavior of others and start observing it without making it define your worth. This clarity leads to smarter decisions about who deserves your time and who drains your potential. You walk through life with more stability because you're no longer chained to what you can't control. Detachment doesn't make you passive. It actually makes you more proactive because you can take action without emotional baggage weighing you down. When you aren't clinging to one specific outcome, you allow yourself to adapt faster when circumstances shift. You're no longer rigid or panicked when things don't go according to plan. You pivot with clarity. This adaptability is one of the greatest long-term advantages of detachment because progress is rarely linear. Life throws curveballs, opportunities fall through, people change, and timelines shift. Detachment allows you to adjust your strategy without interpreting the change as a personal failure. You can ask, what is the smartest move now? Instead of spiraling into frustration about what didn't happen, you stay in motion rather than getting stuck emotionally. You become someone who thrives in uncertainty instead of collapsing under it. This makes your path forward smoother because you're moving with life instead of resisting it. When you embrace what is real, decisions become simpler, faster, and more accurate because you're not running them through the filter of fear or fantasy. You see people as they are, not as you hope they'll become, which prevents you from holding on to relationships that should be released. You see opportunities clearly instead of projecting unrealistic expectations onto them, which keeps you grounded and strategic. You recognize patterns earlier because you're paying attention, not avoiding truths that feel uncomfortable. This awareness leads to better boundaries, healthier goals, and smarter risk taking. It also protects your emotional bandwidth because you're no longer investing in things that only looked good in your imagination. You become the kind of person who makes choices based on truth rather than temporary emotions. This is what creates inner authority, the ability to stand firmly in reality without letting it weaken you. And when you live in truth long enough, you start experiencing a level of peace that people still fighting reality never feel. Peace that comes not from perfection, but from alignment. Accepting reality does not limit your potential. It strengthens your ability to shape the future with accuracy, courage, and clarity. It gives you the ability to look at life honestly, act intentionally, and release the emotional chains that keep most people stuck. Detachment frees your mind, restores your energy, sharpens your judgment, and empowers you to navigate challenges with steadiness instead of panic. It helps you see what needs to change, what needs to continue, and what needs to end. It removes the desperation that clouds your thinking and replaces it with grounded confidence. And in the end, detachment becomes a superpower because it allows you to lead yourself with strength even when life is unpredictable. It lets you rise above drama, ego, and emotional turbulence so you can focus on what truly matters. It turns every challenge into information rather than an identity crisis. It transforms uncertainty into opportunity because you are no longer fighting the moment, you're using it. And when you can do that consistently, life stops feeling like something happening to you and starts feeling like something happening for you.